It's getting to the point to where it's extremely difficult to review some of these filters, guys. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's definitely not a bad thing, especially for most of us. But the reason I say that is because it wasn't maybe, I don't know, 5, maybe 6 years ago, to where you had essentially 2 tiers of filters. You had filters, lens filters that were extremely expensive, but were extremely high quality. And then you had filters who were relatively cheap, but were shit. And now, especially in the last year or so, that schism is beginning to draw parallel to where we're having a lot of filters come onto the market seemingly all at once that are, 1, really, really good optically, 2, readily available for a lot of different lens diameters, and 3, they're really, really cheap, or at least they're relatively cheap to some of these other monstrosities that you see out there. So what has brought all that up from the bottom? It's this little guy right here. It's K&F Concept, their new Nano X variable ND filter. Now, for about 30 seconds before we get going here, some of you may not know what an ND filter is, especially a variable ND filter. Well, of course, ND stands for neutral density filters. It's kind of like a pair of sunglasses for the lens of your camera. It allows you to shoot in brighter light for longer shutter speeds, or it helps equalize, especially videography. It helps equalize your light so you can keep your shutter speed and your frame rates the same for a certain look. Anyway, ND filters for your camera. Variable ND filters are variable. Yeah. Look at that.
Magic.
Very cool thing to have, very much a practical thing to have, especially if, like I said, if you shoot a lot of video, it saves you from having to have a ton of ND filters for different lighting situations. And if you're a still photographer, which primarily I am, it does the same thing. It keeps you from having to constantly switch out your ND filters, and it keeps you from having to buy multiple ND filters when only one will do. The biggest thing with this is, up until, again, not too long ago, most variable ND filters were absolute garbage, at least if you didn't want to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on them. And even then, they weren't that great. Only in the last year or so, I've started using them when I started testing them. And I've got to say, guys, it's kind of changed how I shoot quite a bit, because I had actually switched over more or less from circular filters like this to the square filter kind, just because of those very reasons I mentioned. I could use them on a lot of my lenses. Didn't have to worry about quite as much of the hazards of vignetting, that kind of thing, because they were square and covered more of the lens field. But all that being said, this one's nice. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about the Nano X variable ND filter from K&F Concept. That's short for me saying I'm going to move the camera down here. This is our boy right here, the Nano X. And if you've watched any of my other reviews at all, you know I have this freakishly strange infatuation for the cases and the protective covers that filters come in. This is the second primary iteration of the Nano X. I think this is actually the third variable ND filter that K&F Concept has came out with. But the previous version came in a little case like this. Definitely not bad. I like the protection that it had, hard case. But the only thing is the filter kind of would shift around in there. Rattles a little bit. I think if a hard enough bump, that could maybe cause some problems. But with some of K&F Concept's newer filter systems that they've come out with lately, they came in these little snazzy, super slick, I assume is faux leather cases. And they're all magnetic closures. I really like that. But what I really, really, really enjoy about them is this little magical ribbon here. Just give that a little tug. Yep, there we go, little tug, and out comes the filter. Let's do it again. Gandalf who? Just to reiterate, this is the variable ND filter, the Nano X variable ND filter. It is a variable ND2 to ND400 filter. Don't worry, because I generally can't remember exactly what the equivalence values of that is either. So I've written it down. ND2 is equivalent to about 1 stop of light reduction, and ND400 goes to about 8 2/3 stops of light reduction. If you check K&F Concepts website, this says that it is a 1 to, make sure I get this right. Well, they call it just a 9-stop filter. So 8 2/3 stop, I'll give that to you, calling it a 9-stop filter. But there is a caveat to that, and we'll get to that in just a second when we start talking about some of the little optical anomalies of this filter. This particular model of the variable Nano X filter is the 77mm filter thread size. I tested this across the board on a Sigma 24mm f1.4 art lens. I compared it to a filter from Breakthrough Photography and the square filter actually from K&F Concept, and I'll show you some video and some sample images of all of that here in just a minute. Overall, extremely well constructed. It's very ambiguous. If you look on K&F Concepts actual web page, they call it aluminum. I'm assuming it's aircraft grade aluminum. Most of the time that's what you'll see in filters like these. I prefer brass, because brass is non-galling. I go on about this quite a bit. Non-galling, of course, means it's not as apt to bind together and get stuck when you attach another filter or something like that. So anyway, I can live with aluminum. That's really par for course. The same thing is true for the glass. On K&F's website, they call it, quote, Japan-made top optical glass. No idea what the glass is in this other than that, but apparently it's pretty good. Now, the big standout about the design of this filter is, of course, what K&F at least calls a putter. It's this little aluminum stud that sticks out through here. If you use a lot of rangefinder lenses, this will be kind of familiar to you. What it lets you do is just use a single finger to adjust the density levels of the filter. It really helps you in reducing vibration and at least keeping the whole system that you're filming on, especially when it comes to videography, keeping the whole system stable instead of having to reach around and try to get a hold of that outer ring, which that can actually lead to little fat sausage fingers like mine making their way into the frame. Now, the outside of the filter have these little markings here that go again from the low end to the dark end of the density from ND2 to ND400. Little dots going the way ND density is measured. You go from, let's say this dot is ND2, the next one is double, so ND4, double again, ND8, and that is going to be doubling each time till you reach the 400. Now, the interesting thing about this, and this is what I was going to get back to about the little optical quirks, is if you look at the box that this filter comes in, very pretty box too, by the way, if I may say so. The box actually says that it has no X-cross shadow. Now, what an X-cross shadow is, or what Xing is with a variable ND filter, is caused by the fact that this is actually two circular polarized filters stacked on top of one another, and the darkening effect when you turn it is just an optical quality of turning two polarizers together. You get two circular polarizing filters, put them on top of each other, turn them manually, it does the same thing. Try it, it's kind of cool to see. But even though it says no Xing here on the box, if you look on the K&F Concepts website, you'll see in the questions and answers section that they themselves state that this filter will cause Xing anywhere above 5 stops if you're using a lens that is shorter than 24 millimeters. Now, of course, that's what I was testing on, because that's the widest lens that I have that I can actually add filtration to. And I always like to use that wide one, because if you're going to see more edge softening, if you're going to see more vignetting around the peripherals of the frame, you're more apt to see that on a wider angle lens. And let me tell you, virtually anything above that 5-stop mark, I'm going to pop that up on the screen now, yes, you do see some Xing, and that's when you get all the way over. Personally, when I was looking at this, observing this while I was actually testing it, it looked like it was going over to the little third to last dot here. So if we go to ND2, so there's ND2, ND4, 8, 16, 32, 64. And so that's going to be about 6 stops. So 5, they said 1 to 5 stops. You shouldn't see any Xing. So if you're looking at 6 stops after that, you can probably live with it. However, that does technically make this a practical 6-stop variable ND filter, doesn't it? Instead of the 8 2/3 or the 9 stop that they state. But anyway, just so you know that even though it says no Xing, this will X, especially on lenses that are 24 millimeters and shorter in focal length, and especially when you start topping out on that density, anything over 5 stops. One last thing to mention before we move on to the actual image and video samples is that this is a multi-coated filter. Again, very ambiguous coming from K&F Concept. They call it a nanotech coated filter. It's more or less a multi-layer coating like you see on some other higher end filters. It helps to reduce glare, it helps to reduce chromatic aberrations, and supposedly makes the external surfaces of the glass less apt to smudges, dust, supposedly. It's supposed to just slough off of there, and makes it a little bit more aquaphobic, or oils, water, anything like that that gets on there. It should bead up and be easier to actually wipe off. Okay, that is a good enough rundown of the filter itself. Let's get the laptop out here and we'll go over those image samples and that video sample where I compare this to a few other neutral density filters. I've got to go inside and get the laptop. Okie dokie, so we've got Lightroom Classic opened up here. Let's take a look at the image samples from the K&F Concept Nano X. I should say the Nano 2X. That's their new version of their variable neutral density filter. Got, I think, 9 photos here. We're going to start off with the back-to-back test that I did between the Nano X and the other few filters that we're going to be looking at here. Now, as we go through these images, take a look up here at the top left, and you can see the settings that each one of these was shot on if I happen to forget to mention it. So our first image here is with nothing. This is with that Sigma 24mm f1.4 art. This is at f8, ISO 100. This is, of course, with no filters. The next filter we're going to look at, we're going to go to, let's go to our compare view here. Again, on the left, absolutely nothing, and this first image is going to be with that square filter system, that K&F Concept square filter system. I actually did a review on this not long ago, and I hate to say, folks, I completely botched the focus on this. Zoom in just a little bit. Definitely not the filter itself. If you watched that review, I was very impressed with those. Those are actually my primary filters that I use most of the time, but like I said, you can see that when compared to the non-filtered, everything's just out of focus, and those are some really good filters in their own right. Anyway, moving on to the filter of the hour. This is going to be compared with the variable ND filter, that Nano X2 filter. Looks very, very good when you compare it to the unfiltered version. This is again at f8. Sharpness, honestly, this is at 100%. Let's go to maybe 300%. No real degradation in sharpness. You can, though, however, see that little bit of a color cast going on where we're talking about that 290 Kelvin color cast that K&F Concept states. And you can see definitely here in these clouds a little warmer, not by much. Of course, that's super, super easily corrected. But in terms of sharpness, even at the edges here, it softens up just a little bit. Again, this is at 24 millimeters, but nothing too significant, to be honest with you. At least nothing that I would worry about, at least from a practical standpoint. Okay, let's look at the last filter we tested this against. This is that K&F Concept 6-stop X4 filter. I did my best to dial in the Nano X to approximately 6 stops of light reduction. Like I said, it's not going to be anything exact, but I think we came close. Remember, this is on the left. We have the non-filtered photo, and the one on the right is the dedicated 6-stop filter from Breakthrough. But still, as good as those are, and I love Breakthrough filters, It still softens up just a tiny bit, not much at all. And now they compare the image from the Nano X variable filter. I've put that on the left here, the breakthrough is on the right. Zoom in here again to 300%. And there's really no difference, folks. The only difference here, the aperture on the right is 7.1, where the aperture on the left is 8. And I had to bump up the ISO to 800 on the breakthrough filter photo just because the lighting changed so much. So more or less equal exposures, a much higher price, dedicated 6-stop filter on the right. We have the Nano X variable filter from K&F on the left, dialed in again to approximately 6 stops. As far as sharpness, no, I see virtually no difference between the two filters. If anything, the K&F may, I don't know, very tough to call. So I think that says a lot. It's definitely not any worse. I wish I could have shot these at the same ISO to have a perfect test, but it's not a perfect world. So yeah, very impressed with the sharpness on that. I have a few other sample images here that were made with the K&F. Let's go back to this loop mode. These were some long exposures out of a car of some fields here locally. And then we have one that really shows the sharpness of this. Brighten this up. This is some rain on a window. This image was actually made with the 24 to 70 millimeter Zeiss Vario Tessar f22. Let's back that off to 100%. Sharpness even at the corners, fantastic. Of course, handheld, maybe a little bit of shake in there because this was a 2.5 second exposure, believe it or not. Beautiful sharpness again, vignetting. And keep in mind, this is a 77 millimeter filter. This is on a 72 millimeter lens with a step-up adapter. So you're definitely getting rid of any kind of vignetting that might be occurring with a wider lens. Yeah, beautiful. I have to say, I actually did shoot this as well with some film on the big Bronica GS1 6x7. I think I shot this with a 150 millimeter lens at f4. Don't quote me on that. But just with the film here, if you want to know, this is some Berger Pancro ISO 400. Straight out of the scanner, sharpness is superb on that. So definitely useful. I didn't mention this in the rest of the review, but it's useful if you happen to be a damn dirty film shooter like me, a film obsessive, some might say. A variable ND filter will help you out a lot because unlike with your digital cameras, you can't change your ISO on the fly with your film. Of course, you can push or pull, but that means you're committing to the entire roll or the entire sheet. So the variable ND really comes in handy if you're shooting film, just because you can control the density so much easier than you can with just a dedicated filter system. Oh, and last but not least, I nearly forgot, let's take a look at that video sample. I didn't mention this when we were actually talking about the physicality of the filter, but it's extremely quiet, extremely smooth when you're turning it. I'm going here from the lowest setting all the way to the darkest setting. This is worth mentioning, it has no hard stop, so you can just keep turning it 360 degrees over and over again. And now I'm going to take a look to show you that Xing again in real time. This is that 24 millimeter Sigma f1.4. You can see as you start to approach that 5 to 6 stop density, that Xing really becomes apparent, and then of course it backs off. Now keep in mind, this is with that wide lens, so anything wider than 24 millimeters, you're going to get the Xing, but as you start to head up into a normal range, and especially into a telephoto focal length range, that Xing should all but disappear. I mean, you see what I'm talking about as far as how filters are getting really, really good? Just judging from the image samples that I made there, I really couldn't tell that much difference between this relatively cheap K&F Concept variable ND filter and in the Breakthrough Photography 6-stop ND filter. Like I said, I tried to test everything evenly across the board as far as exposures, that kind of thing. Of course, you did run into that little bit of color cast with the variable ND filter, I think what, 290 yeah, what do we say, 290 Kelvin color cast, so a little warm, not by much, definitely not noticeable on a lot of practical purposes. And I think when you take into account the build quality, the optical quality, how it actually works in use, it's quiet, it's well made. So yeah, what's the price? And believe it or not, just while I was looking up the price to tell all you folks, I think K&F Concept is one of those companies that's essentially always running some kind of sale. The 77 millimeter size that I have here is, believe it or not, 55% off for the next 21 hours. So what time is it now? Central time in the US. It's pushing 8 p.m. So you're looking at a little before 5 p.m. Central time tomorrow on October 2nd. So October 2nd, a little bit before 5 o'clock. You can actually get this for $79.99. The 77 millimeter filter size that is. That's 55% off. The actual prices will range from 49 millimeter, the 49 millimeter filter to that 82 millimeter filter. On sale again, $56.99 for 49 millimeters and $99.99 for the 82 millimeters. Compare that to the Breakthrough Photography 6-stop filter, their X4. You're looking at $169 for that. Of course, free shipping there as well, if I'm not mistaken. But when you take into account the fact that that's one filter, a 6-stop filter, you're getting what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, possibly 8 filters in the ND. So you do the math on that. I think you'll see that, especially for the price that's going on right now, K&F's not too bad. And I will mention, folks, as with all my stuff with K&F Concept, I do a lot of work with them. I have a 5% code. If you happen to miss this sale, you can get the 5% off anything on K&F Concept's website anyway. Oh, just a couple of really quick things before we go. If you happen to notice, this little guy right here, I'm testing out a new wireless lavalier microphone. I generally use a little Rode shotgun mic for everything. So I'm hoping this microphone is going to work out for making audio a little bit better. Let me know what you think compared to some of my other videos. You know, put it down there in the comments. I've actually got this, and from the same company, they sent me an LCD monitor, a little external thing to check out. Turns out it'll work on my 5D Mark III because it used a mini HDMI, but it won't work on my A7R Mark III because that is a micro HDMI cable, and I've got one of those on the way from Amazon. And as always, folks, help me get rid of the ads. Check out my Camera Jockey Clothiers shop over on Spring. You get these weird t-shirts, a lot of very weird and strange stuff for photographers. Fanny packs, cups, stickers, again, strange t-shirts, questionable things on them. I'm trying my best to, like I said, drop the ads, and I'm even trying harder to not start one of those damn dirty Patreons. So check out all the stuff in the description. It really helps support the channel. And of course, when I say support the channel, I'm talking about help make me a living so I can keep doing this. Everything helps, guys, and I really appreciate it. So until next time, I am Adam Welch, and you know me, I don't know how to end these videos.